Making our way through the documentation of Blender 4.0, we are going to be looking at objects and object modes in more detail. The link for this page of the manual will be linked in the description. Please be sure to like and subscribe to support this type of content. Modes allow editing different aspects of objects. While object mode allows you to position, rotate, and scale them, edit mode allows changing their geometry, pose mode allows posing them, and so on. You can actually switch between them while in the layout workspace by just pressing the Tab key instead of selecting this menu each time you want to do so. Pressing Tab will toggle edit mode for objects that support it. But in the drop-down menu, you can change the current mode using the mode selector in the 3D viewport header. Which modes are available depends on the object's type. The complete list is shown here. We mentioned previously in the last video that Control or Command plus tab will open a pie menu as well, for ease of access. Modes can affect many things in Blender. Each mode changes the header and toolbar to show its own unique set of menus and tools. This also means it affects the keyboard shortcuts that are available to you at any given time. Modes can completely change the look of the viewport. For example, weight paint mode will shade the object to show its vertex weights, which are not normally visible. Modes can affect other editors. For example, the UV editor can only be used if the 3D viewport is in edit mode. In the Properties editor too, certain buttons and panels can only be used in certain modes. In Blender, the object modes available to us are Object Mode, the default mode, available for all object types, which allows editing position, rotation and scale, duplicating objects, and so on. Edit Mode, a mode for editing an object's shape, vertices, edges, faces for meshes, control points for curves, surfaces, points, strokes for grease pencil, etc. Sculpt Mode provides an alternative toolset for editing an object's shape, but only for meshes. Vertex Paint Mode, a mesh-only mode that allows you to set your mesh's vertex colors, i.e. to paint them. Weight Paint Mode, a mesh-only mode dedicated to vertex group weighting. Texture Paint Mode, a mesh-only mode that allows you to paint a texture directly on the model in the 3D viewport. And a few others that you won't see here in this video, but there are also Particle Edit Mode, a mesh-only mode dedicated to particle systems useful for editable systems like hair. Pose Mode, an armature-only mode dedicated to posing. Draw Mode, a grease pencil-only mode dedicated to creating grease pencil strokes. It should be noted that normally you would have an arrow cursor, but the cursor becomes a brush in Paint and Sculpt modes. We will cover each of these modes separately in a dedicated video for each of them. In this video, we are mainly going to focus on what they are. If you want to edit two objects at a time, you can do so by selecting both objects at the same time and changing the mode. Also, the Properties editor will only ever show the details, shape keys, UV maps, of the active object, not of all the selected ones. You will need to select the object you want to see to make it active. We are going to have a look at the object mode more specifically. Let's start by asking what an object even is. An object in Blender space is an item in the Blender scene, which in a scene, in and of itself, is constructed from one or more objects. Objects are really just things in the scene, which you are looking at on screen. Things that include objects in this scene, for example, are the cube, the light, and anything that we put in the scene. Each Blender object type, mesh, light, curve, camera, etc., is composed from two parts, an object and object data, sometimes abbreviated to obdata. When referring object, we are really talking about the position, rotation, and size of a particular element. When referring to object data, that holds everything else. For example, meshes store geometry, material list, vertex groups, etc. Cameras store focal length, depth of field, sensor size, etc. Each object has a link to its associated object data, and a single object data may be shared by many objects. If we press Shift+A, we can essentially see a list of different object types. We see a mesh object, which is objects composed of vertices, edges, and polygonal faces, and can be edited extensively with Blender's mesh editing tools. And a curve object, mathematically defined objects which can be manipulated with control handles or control points instead of vertices to edit their length and curvature. A surface object, mathematically defined patches that are manipulated with control points. These are useful for simple rounded forms in organic landscapes. Objects formed by a mathematical function, with no vertices or control points, defining the 3D volume in which the object exists. Meta-objects have a liquid-like quality, where when two or more metaballs are brought together, they merge by smoothly rounding out the connection, appearing as one unified object. A text object. Create a two-dimensional representation of a text. A volume object, a container for OpenVDB files that is generated by other software or Blender's Fluid Simulator. A grease pencil object. Objects created by drawing strokes, see grease pencil primitives. A armature object, used for rigging 3D models to make them posable and animatable. A lattice object, non-renderable wireframes commonly used for the deformation of other objects with help of the lattice modifier. A empty object, null objects that are simple visual transform nodes that do not render. They are useful for controlling the position or movement of other objects. A image object, empty objects that display images in the 3D viewport. These images can be used to aid artists in modeling or animating. A light object, and empty objects that emit light and are used for lighting the scene in renders. A light probe object used by the Eevee render engine to record lighting information for indirect lighting. A camera object. This is the virtual camera that is used to determine what appears in the render. A speaker object, empty objects that bring a source of sound to the scene. A force field object, empty objects that give simulations external forces creating movement and are represented in the 3D viewport as small control objects. And a collection instance object, lets you select from a list of existing collections. Once selected, an empty object will be created, with an instance of the selected collection instancing active. After you add an object to the scene, you can make some adjustments such as how it is aligned and its location and rotation. Be careful though, if you click off of this menu it is gone, so just do what you need to first here. There are other ways of adjusting these parameters though, this is just the easy way. And lastly, you can change the origin of an object. You can set the origin of an object in the header region by going to Object Set Origin. The object origin and geometry can be moved relative to each other and to the 3D cursor. For example, if I move the 3D cursor over here, it moves the origin of the model to the position of the 3D cursor. Meaning now if I press R, you see that I rotate around this origin instead of what you might have expected when it rotates from where it is already at. The origin position has changed. We have a few other types of origins we can choose as well, such as geometry to origin, which moves the model to the origin, and this way the origin of the object will also be at the center of the object. Origin to geometry, which moves the origin to the center of the object. Origin to center of mass, which moves the origin to the calculated center of mass of model, assuming the mesh has a uniform density. And center, which is the median point center bounding box center. With this, you should know mostly what the object mode is, a mode for handling objects in a scene. And that's all we are going to cover in this video. Thanks for making it all the way through. Please be sure to like and subscribe for more software educational content.